Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Morgan Latif Spotlight Sessions. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Elizabeth Carey-Nugent. Elizabeth brings over 30 years of senior leadership experience across the industrial manufacturing industries, where she started her career in Boston Scientific before moving over into the packaging industry, having spent a number of years in big players like Amcor and Scholler Allibert and Eviosys more recently. Today, she finds herself in the third act transition of her career, having moved from an executive day-to-day position now into more of a PE advisory position. She has established her own advisory company, serving into the private equity-backed industrial players going through periods of transformation. She's also doing a real level of research around some of the systemic bias that females face in today's leadership world. And these are some of the topics that we'll be covering today. So, Elizabeth, it's a pleasure to have you join us. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Leo. It's wonderful to be in London and great to see you.
Good to see you. I think, look, I've given some insight into the professional version of you there. Love you to maybe elaborate a little bit and give us some of the more personal backstory of yourself.
Yeah, so I think you've already described it very well. But I mean, my background predominantly came from a very young age. My parents were always strong about education. So I started my career in university with the idea of becoming a chemist and working in a lab. Quickly found out that wasn't really for me. And from there moved into various roles in the west of Ireland in operations, manufacturing. And then the second part of my career was more about commercial. So how do you go from making a product into selling it? And then how do you build a strategy around it? So I think if I look back on some of the main threads throughout my career, is one question I always had is, how does this company make money? And what does the structure of a P&L look like? And from a very young age, I was always thinking about that. And I think that has framed the direction of my career.
And now, like I mentioned in the introduction, you find yourself moving away from the day-to-day life of some of the career that you've had. Walk me through what prompted that shift and where you find yourself today.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I've worked for 30 years in, I would consider, a corporate environment. And I think over the last 2 to 3 years, there have been a couple of pivotal moments that really stood out. And two, I think I remember, and they probably shaped the decision. One was when I was at a very large executive meeting with a very big customer who everybody knows, a global food customer. And we were negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal. I mean, a very big negotiation. And we were going through the contract, and the negotiation took 6 months. It went very well, and we succeeded. And I remember walking out of that meeting and thinking, you know, I've built my career supporting other organizations. I wonder what would happen if I put that same emphasis on supporting myself and maybe moving into something different and making more of an impact. And that thought started fostering, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And the question, what am I doing, right? And then the second pivotal moment was, as you know, in this world, you're in airports, 80% of the time. And I remember sitting in Frankfurt airport, and a flight was cancelled, something was happening, and I sat there, as you do, waiting a lot of times in airports. And I thought about my 4 children. And I said, you know, I've put so much energy into building a corporate career for corporate. I think it's time I start building a career for the third act or the next phase of my life, for myself, to make an impact so that I can show, you know, my children, you can have different phases in life. And they're the two moments. And I think once you start thinking like that, you can't really stop thinking. And it's all a matter of investigating it and having the courage then to take the leap.
Is it what you expected it to be?
No, actually, I thought it was going to be a much more difficult transition. So if you can imagine, you're up every morning at 6 a.m. and you're working through your day. Now, there's nobody pushing you to do that. You have to do it for yourself. And I thought that would be very scary, but actually it's wonderful because you have an inbuilt sort of a rhythm anyway. And the psychological impact at the start was probably the worst part. So somebody will say to you, what do you do? And I would say, I'm a VP, I'm a CCO, I'm whatever. And that had formed part of my identity. But now I had to practice not making excuses when people say, what do you do? And then I would say, oh, I'm just, or I'm doing this. Now I say, well, I'm developing, I'm working on my portfolio career and I'm loving it. So it's a different narrative in your own mind. And then there's the realization that you have one life. You have to do what you want to do. And if you have the opportunity, go for it.
And has that changed your perspective, changing seats from being busy in the day-to-day to then taking more of an advisory or looking over a business in the way that you do? Has that changed your perspective on leadership and how business operates?
Yeah, I think one of the advantages of working in corporate for that long, especially in non-traditional female roles, maybe like P&L roles, CFO type roles, is that you understand the metrics. But when you're on the advisory side, you also can understand what the leaders that you're talking to and supporting are going through. So you have a much broader perspective, you have more time to think, and you can focus a little bit more on the geopolitical situation around. So you're not always looking in a box, you're looking at the wider perspective. And that is really a change, yeah.
You touched on an interesting point that it is very much a male-dominated industry all throughout your career. You also mentioned that it was a conscious decision to almost tackle that and invite yourself and join a male-dominated industry where maybe you didn't have to. Why did you do that?
I think part of it is because in any organization, I always had a very keen understanding of where the power was. And when I was my first job in a lab or in Boston Scientific on the manufacturing floor as an engineer, I remember going to business reviews. And the leader of the business review, who was discussing all of the metrics, not just one part of the metrics, but the efficiency numbers, the cost, the money side of it, always seemed to have more influence. And I always said, well, if he can do it, I would love to do it. I want to understand that. So I had that understanding that, if you can follow the money and the influence, you'll get more impact and you're easily visible for promotions if you can understand that. Yeah. So that's sort of something that I don't know where that came from. Probably from my father in a lot of ways, always, pushing me to go into environments that weren't always female led. So, yeah.
Do you feel that landscape is changing now?
I would say in certain areas it's changing, but I think we could do a lot more in terms of inviting more females into the non-traditional roles. And I'll give you an example. When I interview females for C-level positions on behalf of private equity companies currently, or I might be asked to mentor a female, I might ask, what did you do this year in terms of your portfolio and your numbers? Oftentimes the female will say, I supported the EBITDA impact of 10%, where the male counterpart will say, I drove the impact of 10%. So when I dig a little bit deeper, actually the female led the initiative. It was her EBITDA. There's a feeling sometimes that if you say, you're not a team player. And I don't believe that narrative for women in positions holding P&L. They need to push forward. Because then other women will feel more encouraged.
But where does that come from and how do we change that? I suppose it's also a perception of how women perceive themselves in these positions, and you've given some reasons as to why they may communicate as they do. What advice would you give on that point?
Well, I think a lot of it is down to the system that we see. I mean, if you look at some of the metrics at the moment, in mid-management positions, it's less than 30% of women that are often promoted to these roles. So I think we have to encourage organizations to promote women more into middle management roles so there's a bigger pipeline. But also, it's to encourage women to actually go into the roles that are non-traditional. So science, but get into the finance roles, get into the operations roles. Senior sales leadership roles are a fantastic way to understand the mechanics of deal flow, M&A positions, and not to be afraid. And also, instead of looking for a mentor, which is a lot of what women do, look for a sponsor. Look for somebody who has a little political prowess. I mean, it's okay having a mentor and going for a cup of coffee with them, but you want to have somebody in a room when you're not there to say, look, she's really fantastic and I want to sponsor her. And it's not just that you can go up to somebody and say, listen, will you sponsor me? You have to build a relationship and show this is what I can do for you. So it's being a little bit strategic about, the reason why I've been successful and gotten promoted over the years is because I've been able to show that if you want to grow by 10%, I'll help you grow by 10%. If you want to increase EBITDA, I'll help you with the headcount reduction. I'll help you with the efficiency gains. Then they understand the currency. And that's one way to sort of progress. And that's what I would always try and do and encourage other women to do.
Because the gap only exaggerates the more senior you get, I would say. And particularly looking at the transition that you've made, it seems that there is a reluctance or a fear or some kind of blocker mentally where women are underrepresented in advisory and non-exec director positions. Why do you feel that is, and how can we change it?
Yeah, that's a great observation. If you look at the metrics right now across Europe, on board positions, which is like non-executive board positions, women are starting to get represented because there's a policy in place. So in the UK, it is fantastic. On FTSE companies, it's almost 40%. In the Nordic countries, it's over 30%. And in Germany, over 30%. And that's because it's mandated. But when you go into, as you say, the executive roles and the layer down, it's not very good, right? And especially at C-level, it's under 10% public companies in Europe are CEO females. The reason for that is when females get to management position, there's what we call a broken rung. We need to have sort of not a quota, but we need to have at least 40 or 50% females going up into the next level of director and then further. But the layer underneath is missing, so the pipeline isn't there. So they either come in from somewhere else or from the side, and that's what's happening at the moment. So it's a very good observation. And the only way to do that is actually to insist that an organization on the management level has much more of a pipeline. And that makes things much more equitable when they get to the next level up.
What is your view on those policies or those quotas?
So I'm not a fan of quotas for quota's sake or what we call tokenism. But I would be a fan of organizations having 50-50 split in certain positions. So if you look at universities, if you look at certain countries where they've introduced policies of let's have a representation of 50% female in science or technology, that has really worked 10 years on. So I'm a fan of that. I think you have to make a conscious effort and understand that everybody has bias. I mean, I recognize that I would hire somebody who I think is like me. That's a bias. I have to stop myself and say, I need a bit more diversity. I need somebody who has X, Y, and Z. And I understand that it's not always conscious, but it's a reason why we're not seeing more representation.
It feels like the criteria is evolving slightly when people are being brought into business or we're looking at succession planning and how people grow. AI is already and will continue to play a role in that. And I'd like to understand your perspective on the role that AI will play when we talk about bias. You've been doing some research on that. Can you give us some insight?
Yeah, so following on from my original paper on bias, I started in 2023 and you remember ChatGPT was just coming out and now it's completely exploded beyond belief, right? But I think in the last year, there's been a lot of research done on AI in terms of HR metrics and in terms of what AI means in an organization. And what they found is that where a structure has used the performance review or PAIDAR, and it's on a particular electronic system, when you migrate over to AI, you take the existing system, and that already has inbuilt bias. There's been some very good studies done on language models where two people with the same job, male and female, the narrative used to describe the man is, strategic, passionate, game changer. The narrative used for women is team player, empathetic, nurturing, collaborative. That's not the person that you want oftentimes running a P&L in a crisis mode, and it doesn't always set the woman up for success. So the terms used need to be changed. And there's a recent analysis done on LinkedIn, and there is actually a lot of work by a lot of female founders in the UK where they can prove that their potential reach on LinkedIn hasn't gone as well as expected because of some inbuilt system bias. So they're not getting as much reach. They've actually decided to change their sex on LinkedIn to male, and they see more feedback and more engagement. And that is because of the system and the structure of the work environment. It's just numbers, right? So I do see a change, but it's not happening as fast as it could happen. Yeah.
I suppose you've stripped it down to the bare basics of the actual language of AI and almost the coding within the systems. How will that evolve, do you feel, moving forwards to, I suppose AI in its core is very strong at the basics right now, but how does that become more professional and more complex?
Well, there's a lot of organizations now introducing AI that I'm working with into supply chain, HR, quality, customer service and sales. They will have traditional systems like CRM and things already in place. What they're doing to make sure that, because AI is going to get better, no doubt, and it's the emotional element and the narrative element that is not built into the models, right? So what a lot of organizations are doing now is they're doing audits on some of the, for instance, HR organization applications or performance reviews. If you take 10 of them and look through the outcome of AI from performance reviews and the new structure of performance reviews, you can actually code various words and do a test. And there are tests now being developed for AI to create a bias gate, which is really positive. So they're starting to do that as well now. Yeah.
If we move away from bias and we talk more about the use of AI, you've mentioned quality, and from more of an operational lens, what results are you starting to see where there might be case studies of AI being used in that sense, where it's genuinely working and there are lived examples of improvement? And just curious to understand your view and some of the stories you may have heard where it's winning.
So, very good question. If we were to listen to everybody talking about AI now, we would consider that nobody's going to have a job and everything is falling apart with all of the talk that we're hearing. But what I've seen so far is in pockets, AI is working. In supply chain or procurement, AI is working, whereby you will use the system to procure, say, resins, etc., and link the procurement process to the supplier and then predict a model in terms of usage on your S&OP process. I've seen that working. The big drawback with implementation of AI is that it assumes that people in the organization know how to use it, and it assumes that the base MMR system is able to actually accommodate the AI implementation. And that's why now a lot of coders who are graduating from universities are now actually becoming what we call back-end technicians in these big organizations to help. I have found, I've done a lot of research on one of my papers, on one of my newsletters, which says that there's a big gap between what's expected in the implementation of AI and the cost of the program. So, I mean, there's a huge financial burden now where companies are bringing in AI programs and they have no measure on the ROI. So I think that's going to get a little bit better. And I do have a real life example from a week ago where a particular board was asked to sign off on AI implementation for 3 million. And I was asked to take a look at it. The actual stipulation and the request just didn't make sense. There was no ROI, there was nothing. And the management team didn't know how to actually measure it, right? So we're now developing on boards questions for the leadership team, for the board. If somebody comes to you with an AI integration plan, what are the questions that you need to ask and how do you know it's working? And that's why I would encourage a lot of leaders now to upskill as much as possible, understanding, because you don't have to be a coder, right? But how do you know that this is actually going to deliver the return? It's very easy in customer service, right? You can say, I have 100 customer service agents. I want to reduce my headcount. I want to deploy that staff in another area. And then you can implement AI agents. That's tried and tested, right? So they're and they're a little bit better than the chatbots that you have for years. That's easily done, but there are other areas that are a little bit lagging behind.
Yeah, it's ultimately, how do you track it? What is the current state? What is the desired future state? And how much of an impact is AI actually playing in that change?
Yes.
Which is ultimately not the easiest thing to measure based on what you're saying. There are areas where you can, but room to improve in others, right?
Exactly. And I mean, from a recruiting perspective, one of the stipulations now, if you're looking to actually, for anyone looking to go on a board or to become a non-executive director or to advise, one of the skills that they're looking for outside of ESG, sustainability, and maybe some war scars from career in terms of P&L responsibility is AI familiarity. So that's something that, I think it's a wonderful tool and a wonderful opportunity for people to get upskilled as much as possible.
So it's an evolving criteria also in the selection process for people getting into those executive positions in maybe what is a more traditional industry. And it's actually those that are upskilling themselves on tech, AI, processes, systems that will have the advantage.
Exactly. The secret sauce right now, for many people who've worked for 20 years in an industry that might seem boring, a defensive industry like packaging, maybe they're beside an injection molder all day, they have a huge advantage if they can actually marry their technical skill with AI. Their value proposition is that they can work with experts in organizations as a non-executive director and decode some of what AI is saying through their practical knowledge. Because if you look at university graduates now when they come out, they probably don't have the same opportunities that I did in terms of learning the skill on the shop floor. And it's very difficult to explain a plastic or metal process to somebody who's never worked there, or from a pitch pack. You need to be able to talk about the idiosyncrasies as well. So I think it's a massive opportunity for a lot of people who have that in-depth process knowledge.
Have you found any themes across the businesses that are adopting it well versus those who may be late adopters or haven't even tried it yet? And what are you seeing?
So the organizations that are adopting it well are the ones that take it in bite-sized chunks and focus on a specific area. I've seen some excellent supply chain and procurement AI implementations, which marry up your S&OP process with SAP. They've gone really well. And there's a very clear ROI. I've seen some excellent customer service adoptions. And then, the other one that's emerging now is the shared service center, which has been around for a lot of, and oftentimes you have a shared service center, but you've got pockets of business everywhere else. I've seen some very good implementations of AI in those instances. And you're absolutely right. It's such a traditional industry. You wonder, well, how is that going to work, right? But it does work. Yeah.
And what about the different operating models of different businesses? You've had a lot of exposure to private equity-backed companies, but actually, can you walk us through some of the differences that you see from something like that, where it's much faster paced, and there's a different set of expectations, I think is fair to say, to maybe a family owned or a different kind of organization in terms of their appetite in adopting things like AI?
Yeah, great question. So I have worked with PE-backed family firms. I've worked with PE-backed pure financial businesses where the family are not on the board anymore. And I've worked with public companies. In terms of private equity, they are much more readily open for adaptation of AI linked to ROI, because their very nature is, we have a set of KPIs, we have 7 years, we want to increase our EBITDA, cash flow, grow the business, invest, make an impact, and sell. And so they are very acute at understanding and aware of, okay, if we implement AI, this is what we need, this is where we're going to do it. So they're very good at it. Private or family businesses, they prioritize for legacy. So they're optimizing for legacy. So I've been in boardrooms where the founder maybe invented the product, and maybe the product is not selling anymore, and maybe you want to move away from the product. There'll be much more of an emotional connection. And so they might not prioritize as many AI adoptions as a pure private equity play. In that organization, then there might be a little bit more psychological safety for people working there, right? And then public companies, again, they are really now getting just as fast as private equity. They have more leverage, they have more finance, and they can use some of the better organizations. So yeah, interesting question. And it brings up a question about psychological safety, because I know with a lot of people I'm speaking to now, working in a company is quite difficult now, because you don't know, am I going to have a job? What's going to happen? There's so much change, and it's quite different to the traditional way of working.
Was there anything in particular about private equity that drew you to it?
I like the fact that in private equity, it's very, it is what it says on the tin, right? We're here, we're going to buy this business, we're going to enhance it, and we're going to sell it on for a profit. And there are certain models that I really like. I mean, the Brookfield model of actually, bringing people in and working as an operating partner with the existing team. And there are other models that maybe the private equity partners leave you alone a little bit, but expect the results. And so I've been lucky with the private equity companies that I've worked with. There are, not some great examples. And remember, there are so many private equity companies out there. They're everywhere. They're like a chain of Aldi or Lidl. There's people think there's only very small. There's private equity everywhere, and a very small percentage of them actually succeed. So you can have small private equity, large private equity. So you have to be careful which ones you actually go and work for. But I've enjoyed private equity because it's. I don't buy into the whole we're a family and because I think people are individuals. And I think the one thing I've taken from my entire career is, like life, you're responsible for yourself and your happiness and your outcome. And most of life's turmoil is going on in your head, right? And if you can get over that, wherever you work, you'll have a good experience. I also know that I'm very open to change and I thrive on change. So
yeah, you write about this a lot in your newsletter that you produce, and private equity and how that's changing, and potentially we've spoken about the evolving criteria for senior leadership positions, but also advisory roles into PE. To come back to our earlier conversation around women in leadership and the access that they may or may not have to those kinds of opportunities, can you walk me through any guidance or lessons that you've learned in terms of a framework that some of our audience could maybe implement if they are in a similar stage to you in your career, or looking to make that jump and replicate what you've done? What would you share?
Yeah, I think, I've shared some of the key points that drove me to make the decision. I think what I would say is, if you're in a corporate environment and you've been thinking about moving somewhere else or going into a non-executive director role and things like that, there's a couple of things I would actually think about before jumping. I mean, there's no doubt you have to have some sort of financial stability, right? I mean, it's all very well saying follow your passion, which is the worst advice I've ever heard, because you have to have some sort of financial stability, maybe be at a certain life stage and have a plan, right? So that's what I would say. Then if you decide, okay, I want to have a portfolio career, I want to do the same kind of work, but maybe a couple of different aspects. Just ask yourself, what do I like to do? How do I like to do it? And then, for instance, if you want to become a non-executive director in a public or private board as a female, there are a couple of things that you need to have in place that will give you a head start. And maybe 4 things, right? So you need to understand, I'm talking about packaging and industrial right now, and maybe energy as well. Understand ESG, right? Understand every single thing there is to know about ESG. Understand sustainability. What does that mean? What are the regulations saying in the future? Be able to show what I call some battle scars. So, I mean, I've had some very, very good mentors, mostly male actually, and sponsors, and some chairmans and things like that. And they've all said they like to hire female non-executive directors who have proven failure and who have been fired, who've had very bad situations and who've got up and actually continued, who have what we call battle scars, so that they have a proven resilience. And then it's really non-negotiable to understand a P&L, right? Really get into the money side of things, right? That's something. And then finally, I would say, get accustomed and get familiar with AI and how that impacts business overall. And then in terms of portfolio life, you don't need to have a big idea. I think you just have to do it, right? And don't be afraid if that's something that you want to do.
Do you feel comfortable to share some of your battle scars, but I think more importantly, what you learned from them and maybe why it's those failures that resonated most when you're in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, oh my God, there's so many. I think if I look back, I think maybe 10 years ago, I used to get so emotionally invested in the job, right? And even with the kids and everything, I was such a people pleaser and wanting to do my best all the time. And I always thought I had to have the answer in every meeting. And I would have been better off saying, I don't know. But I constantly wanted to prove myself all the time instead of saying, actually, I'm here, I'm enough. And after a period of time, I got better at that. You know, the other thing is sometimes it's okay not to know. And instead of pushing forward, it's particularly in sales, right? When you're in sales and you have a target, you should always have a stretch target. But if the target, you can't meet the target, is give an early warning system and don't take it all on yourself. There's some of the things. And it's okay to not perform well and have a failure. I remember, oh my God, it must be, and this is really now 15 years ago, maybe more. I was at a board meeting and I was asked a question. And I was so, worried and nervous that I completely went blank in the meeting in front of everyone, right? In front of everyone. And it was really the pin drop moment. And I walked out of that meeting and I was devastated. And looking back at it now, I should have just, all right, I didn't know the answer. Fine. It took me so long to get over that. When I look back, it was wonderful because after that experience, I remember that situation. I remember it was a particularly nasty board meeting. I've been in a lot of nasty board meetings with some very not nice people. And what I should have done is just, said, I've gone blank and left the room, or said, I'll come back or get a glass of water. But I froze. And I think that happens to men and women. Looking back on it now, it was a gift because I know, what that was like, or lots of things. I mean, it's so many things. I think it's your reaction to failure that actually helps you. Age is a great thing, and perspective. I mean, it's a job, and it's a privilege to work in some of these roles. You meet so many great people. So, yeah.
Imposter syndrome, I suppose, is what you may have described or is a very similar theme to what you've just described, in the sense of getting something wrong, inevitably making mistakes, as we all do, but then it's the response to that and how you perceive that mistake on yourself. Is that something that you face today, or even more recently, when it comes to imposter syndrome?
I think that women in particular feel it all the time. I think as you get older, it isn't as prevalent as, for me, I don't feel it as much as I did, but you're absolutely right. You do feel imposter syndrome. When I decided to make this jump, I set myself a target that I'm going to announce it, and the whole thing of, what will people think? All that. I think the more you do, the less imposter syndrome you have. And I think as well, you get older and you really start thinking, I don't care. I'm so happy. I don't care what people think. What's the worst thing that can happen? But it's part of life. I look at my daughters and my sons, and they're full of it as well. Imposter syndrome. I think it's part of life. And sometimes it's like an early warning system to help you. And if you can go into the room and realize nobody's thinking about what you're thinking, they're just thinking about themselves, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's an easy thing to focus just on yourself, and like you reference, everyone has those feelings, and I think bringing that to the floor is an important message.
Yes.
Especially for men and women who inevitably face it. But as you grow in your career, it's maybe your perspective that changes on that. What advice have you given to your 4 children who you maybe see going through education at this stage and walking into early periods of their careers?
Well, I always say to them, it can always get worse, which is probably not great advice, but I always say things can get a lot worse than this, right? So everything is okay. Nothing is unfixable. It can get worse, and have some perspective. And they're, I know exactly how they feel, because I remember being that age. It's not easy, right? So exams, COVID, will I meet this person? Will I meet that person? Will I be a success? What am I going to do? All these questions that are in their heads all the time. And I say to them, I don't think it's a good idea to give them too much advice. They have to go through it. And I think it's very important that they go through a lot of hardship and pain, because it'll build resilience. I'm not talking about like physical safety, and you don't want that. But I mean, the other thing I say to them all the time is, in today's economic climate, always understand how much you're earning and how much is going out. So I'm very big on financial literacy for my children. I think it's extremely, especially for girls, nowadays. And actually, they're pretty good on that kind of stuff. So yeah, work hard. It's a privilege to be where we are. Things can always get a lot worse. So that's kind of the advice I give them. And pick your career based on what you're interested in. I don't say follow your passion, because if we followed our passion, we'd be all doing very strange things, right? And sometimes you're not going to make any money following your passion. But I try to give them practical advice. It doesn't always work, right? But okay.
Good. I'd like to lean on some of your other research in the Queen Bee effect. Maybe for the listeners, if you could introduce what this idea is and some of the findings that you've had.
Yeah, so the research that I started in the Vrije University in Amsterdam was framed around the queen bee phenomenon. And that term was coined in the 70s. And it describes a phenomenon where women in positions of power distance themselves from other women in order to get ahead, and maybe are not so nice to their women cohorts or women that maybe report to them. And I chose that subject because I always understood that when I got to certain levels and was working with other women, I saw the challenges they went through, but also how maybe their personalities changed. And I didn't buy that queen bee phenomenon. I thought, this is, so the investigation that I've done so far in the first paper I did shows that it's a myth. It's system inbuilt. I used some very old philosophers from the past, and really the system that you walk into, really, it's like any system. Wherever you're born, that's where you're nourished and created. So it's not actually the fault of the woman, it's the system. That's not to say that there are not narcissists and crazy leaders out there as well. That's a separate thing. But it's usually the system that creates the queen bee, and it's about understanding and mitigating the unconscious bias that's in the organization.
But that's exactly it. It is unconscious a lot of the time, and maybe not something that these other women or female leaders have recognized in themselves, even when reflecting. So how do you mitigate that? And how do you change what is more of a systemic bias?
So again, it's in numbers. It's by having a balance of men and women in the organizations, and it's actually creating policies whereby you can actually see bias. And you ask yourself when you're doing a performance review or when you have people on your team, you have people on your team, everyone does, that they might not like, or they might be pretty annoying. I know I'm pretty annoying when I work on someone's team. Really, I'm sure I know I am. But it's then, okay, this person is annoying. Am I annoyed because they're not like me? Am I annoyed because they're male or female? Am I annoyed because I don't like them? Are they doing good work? So just check yourself all the time. I mean, we have bias all over the place every day. So it's really to try and be present when you're working with teams, and look around. I mean, it's funny because I've just come back from Sweden. Sweden is just, the board meeting I was at is a wonderful place to be in terms of understanding narratives and bias. That seems to be inbuilt in the Nordic culture, that they can see it, right? And so that's something that we need to start, even with our children at home and organizations, is actually calling it out. And you'd be amazed when you're conscious in a day how much bias you actually have. It's fascinating when you have time to think, why did I actually think that? Because I don't like them? Or where's that coming from? A lot of it is coming from your home, your childhood, so that's kind of some things that organizations can do, and develop programs around it.
What would those programs look like? And you've just mentioned that when you take the time to reflect yourself, you recognize that these biases exist in your day-to-day life. How, at a larger organizational scale, can we develop a framework or a blueprint that recognizes that but also mitigates it?
So I have done some very nice programs over the years in larger organizations, and indeed private equity companies, where they bring teams in and actually don't tell anybody what they're doing. It's a training program, and they ask questions about gender, race, all sorts of different questions, background, language, and then they display the results. And so it's about putting a mirror up to the team to say, this is the bias. And then they'll give you a 10-point plan every day when you're working about decision-making and inbuilt bias and decision-making. What's really nice about it is there are programs where you can do a video or conversation with somebody and they can point out the bias in the conversation. Some very good programs out there. I would encourage all organizations to use them. And then it puts it up, and it's very good for hiring as well. Because when you're making hiring decisions, you end up with a much more diverse team.
It's a very interesting point, particularly in hiring, where you look at a piece of paper and you can make some initial assumptions. You then meet someone virtually and then you see them, and body language also plays a factor. And then the third level of actually meeting someone face to face will reveal something entirely new. So from a hiring perspective, uniquely, how do you address that from the very start of the funnel, the top end of the funnel, where we're looking at building a pipeline, so to speak, from a candidate perspective? How have you as a leader in a hiring process addressed it?
Well, I recently developed a program for an organization, a public organization, who were hiring staff into roles at junior level in government bodies. And it was a questionnaire. And I asked on the questionnaire some very specific questions around bias, and they have to tick a box. So before the person enters the room, they have to actually fill in the form, 10 questions like, where's this person from, male or female, which college did they go to? And then afterwards, why did you choose this person? And very almost answering the questions, did you choose this person because? And oftentimes they come back and they go, yeah, I don't think I should have given, and then they'll do a re-interview. So it's actually asking 10 questions before, 10 questions after, and then measuring the two against each other. It's actually like, almost like a safety sign when you walk around. It's actually just getting into the present moment and saying, I'm going to do this interview. I'm opening my mind. If this person went to the same college as me, or this person likes the same shoes, or likes the same football, I'm not going to hire the person because of that. Or that kind of thing. Or this person grew up in the same environment that I grew up in. They know my struggle. Or this person is this color, or this person is those kind of things, right?
I suppose it's the safe option. It's the classic, would you go for a beer with this person?
Yes.
Then you should hire them.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's a level of safety or security in seeing yourself maybe in someone else that gives you a reassurance that they will be okay and they will work out. Whereas someone on the polar opposite end of that spectrum could be a risk, or I suppose you could perceive it as one in your own mind.
That's a great point. Exactly. And it leads me to another conversation for women and men. I think we forget, because it's a great point. Once we've cleared the bias issue, organizations are political, right? Really political. And it's a liking game. And if you're working in an organization and maybe people find you annoying or you're not likable, it might be the wrong environment. Maybe you're not in the right garden. You need to move to another garden. I think for women as well, in order to get ahead, you have to have an influence and a likability factor. And people don't talk about that a lot. It's you have to be able to influence. I'm not going to use the word network, but people have to like you enough to want to work with you. And so, the bias part is one thing, right? But then you get into the organization and you start blowing things up, and, you start, maybe you talk too soon. I've done that a lot of the times when I was younger in my career. Maybe you voice your opinion. You're voicing your opinion in an environment where it's not open enough. So I think that is something that everyone should know. When you walk into an organization, you're working for somebody else. You're in somebody else's environment, and you don't go in, showing your full personality. You have to play a little bit of it. It's not a game. You're being strategic. And I think I worry about the younger generation now who maybe were working from home and they're not really aware of those nuances, because that's a massive part. I have seen the most incompetent people rise to C-level because everybody likes them.
You mentioned the flip side of everyone liking you and maybe being perceived as annoying or other adjectives.
Yeah.
Where's the line in terms of changing yourself to fit a profile that makes sense for the business and that will promote you and put you in a better light, versus actually changing the environment and recognizing that you are not right for the environment, or vice versa? Because I suppose when we talk about culture fit and traits and preference and working style, yes, culture to an extent is about likability and these things, but actually the fundamental misunderstanding, I think, in what a culture is traits, preferences, working styles, ability to adapt, and so forth. Where do businesses get that wrong, or where do individuals get that wrong and not necessarily recognize where the change needs to fall?
I think a lot of people today walk into organizations with one perception. The organization sells something and they walk in with a perception. And they don't realize that it is necessary to adjust your style to meet the organization. And that might take 6 months. And my advice is always adjust your style, watch and listen. However, I think there's a line. If you have a toxic culture and you have a situation where at a board meeting that somebody is blatantly getting bullied and everyone sits there and says nothing, that's a problem. That you don't want to be the person sitting in that room. You want to have enough courage to say, even though it might be financially, detrimental to you, I want to look in the mirror every day and say, okay, I don't want to wake up 20 years' time and say, I sat there while that was happening. You want to be the person in the room to say, I don't really agree with this. Can we take a break? And then make sure that you're not being over dramatic or oversensitive about the situation. In a toxic environment, if you're getting up every day, you're changing your personality, you're feeling ill, you need to get out of there. That is then, and you've done the objective work to say, am I being over dramatic or oversensitive? Am I taking things to heart? And it's affecting your health, you need to go. But I have seen so many organizations that are really toxic, and you need to make a decision. And then it's on you, right? And in my experience, where I have moved positions or walked away, I've never regretted it. The only thing I've ever regretted is staying too long. So
it's interesting. From the perspective of a headhunter and the role that I have, we're very much in a candidate-led market where candidates seem to have options, and candidates more increasingly have more power in an interview process to actually reject or turn down potential roles. And from what I've seen, it's more increasingly on that point. Yes, it might be a good step for them financially or in their career from a functional standpoint, but actually their level of enjoyment in the role from some of the things that you've just mentioned is a much bigger factor. And it seems that people have a louder voice in those topics.
Yeah, I think depending on the position, and maybe since COVID as well, and the fact that we see a lot more emphasis on well-being, etc., there's a lot more options out there for people. You don't have to stay somewhere where you're miserable. So I think that's important too. But, I always say that it's important I think everyone should work long enough in an organization to understand the culture. And I'm not saying, walk out the door if somebody, has a conflict with you. I mean, I'm talking about really nasty stuff that is unacceptable. But I think it's on an individual basis. Maybe people are not right for a corporate environment. Maybe they should try something else, And again, I'm very conscious that a lot of people don't have that option. They have to work, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Elizabeth, it's been a pleasure. So I want to thank you for your time. It's been a really, really interesting discussion, and I'm sure that the audience will agree.
Thank you. Thank you, Leo. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, really, really good discussion. That was great.
Yeah.